you just mentioned there will be fewer people around. If there's a 5-year rebuild time and then we suffer energy and fertilizer and food scarcity for 5 years, what does that look like?
Is the plan to keep it closed for a certain X amount of months? What's the target on this? Once the target's achieved, and I'm not talking about Trump's goals, I'm talking about this 2030 agenda goal here. Like, how long would they really need to keep it closed to achieve these goals or get people moving to a completely different economy that's now digitized, where people will accept the biometric IDs to be able to eat?
If governments end up having to pay UBIs to the population that isn't working, and then also the government has to figure out how to provide food and electricity for the masses that are not working. I mean, it seems obvious that sooner or later the government's going to say, well, we got to get rid of these people. I think maybe the other silver lining is that there will no longer be denial of the agenda. Hopefully they will realize that that was the plan the whole time, was to engineer a way to shut off the world's energy system. And today I'm joined by David Dubine from Adapt 2030. And welcome, David. It's great to have you on today.
Yeah, thank you. So changes in the world are so swift right now. It's almost like we're living through COVID 2.0 in the same way that everything's copy pasting so fast at lightning speed this time.
Yeah, isn't it? In fact, that's a lot of what we're going to talk about today, is some of the incoming impacts, especially supply chains and energy and so on. And you, are you okay to share where you are right now?
Yeah, I'm in Taipei in Taiwan.
Your assessment of what it means if the Strait of Hormuz stays closed and these fuel deliveries remain extremely scarce, what's that going to look like?
In time, it will play out, because I was tracing the fuel supply chain from Taiwan, and it does flow through Malaysia and through Singapore, as in Singapore delivers 9% of gasoline and diesel back to Taiwan. But at the same time, Russia had stopped those deliveries to Malaysia, and they stopped the deliveries over to Singapore. And at that itself, that's like 16% of the total deliveries that are inbound, which, I look at this whole supply chain thing, Mike, and I'm like, you're telling me Russia sends gasoline down to Malaysia and to Singapore, and they just basically rebox it and then send it back to Taiwan in some sort of maniacal trade deal, when everything could come directly here. You know what I mean? So you look at all these different
that
sources.
might be just political, right?
Yeah, and Abu Dhabi was one of the main exporters, about 15%, so that's at zero. And, as long as this Russian gasoline keeps getting delivered, there'll be some pullbacks. But as well as I, the cohesive society will do what is asked. Maybe they won't drive and it'll just go to 100%. Everybody, use public transport. And that would be an easy one. People would obey that and be like, okay, yeah, sure, that's awesome, man. We can work like that. But, in our divided society, that just won't. It'll be like, give me mine, comparatively. So I'm here to live the shortages. I'm here to, dive into the deep end and really see what is happening and how this manifests, because it'll manifest out here. Just like COVID, it happened in Asia first. And although, it's not going to come here, it won't affect us, we're energy producers, and then, it did. We got the best, remember back in the COVID day where they were saying, oh, it's never going to affect America, we got the best medical system on the planet, and it just steamrolled through everywhere. On purpose, of course.
Right. Well, I think you're going to be in it, because the new law signed by, announced by Russian Deputy Prime Minister Alexander Novak, that goes into effect, says that all gasoline exports are banned out of Russia to the whole world. So there won't be any gas going to Singapore, Malaysia, Taiwan, anybody.
And what overlaps with that is the last deliveries of the tankers that had left the Strait of Hormuz at that time that are finally arriving and unloading in Asia. That's the last ones. There's no more. Like, once the ones that are here or very close to reaching port or in port, at that point, that's it. There's no more.
Wall Street doesn't lose money on sell-offs, you do. They create the panic, wait for you to dump your position out of fear, and scoop it up at a discount. The big banks aren't selling their gold, they're buying yours. Right there waiting with open hands. That's why I tell people talk to Noble Gold Investments. They'll help you build a long-term plan and, more importantly, help you stick to it when the noise gets loud. The minor ups and downs, that's weather. The long-term trend, that's climate. And the climate's been favoring gold for 5,000 years. So the next time you see a dip and feel that knot in your stomach, ask yourself one question. Am I making the decision, or is Wall Street making it for me? Don't let them shake you out of the position you built to protect yourself. That's exactly what they want. And right now, all new qualified accounts receive a free 10th ounce American Gold Eagle as a thank you. A real gold in your hands, that's the whole point. Visit 2030gold.com and discover how easy it is to protect your financial future. That's 2030gold.com. Click on that link in the description box below.
Right. And what we know is that people everywhere, whether they're Taiwanese or American, they don't prepare, and then they panic at the last minute when the supply is gone. So I wouldn't expect very many people to be preppers in Taiwan. Taiwan, I mean, you and I both know Taiwan culture quite well. It's not a prepper culture. I don't think I ever met a single prepper in Taiwan, ever. You know what I mean?
Except myself buying food here and putting some in the drawer.
Right.
Okay.
It's just like you don't run into preppers anywhere, in my experience, in Taiwan. I mean, there are some farmers out, on the East Coast, etc., but it's not, the vast majority of the population live obviously in the cities, and they don't prep. They depend on the system.
Yeah, and that's going to be a great case study to see how this system here handles the fuel shortages when they arrive, and how quickly they arrive, how quickly government's going to remove taxes. They had a fuel supply rise out here, or actually a price increase, but the government absorbed about half of that. So 15% went up just a few days back, and government took some taxes away and absorbed about half of that 15%. Otherwise, it would have been a 30% increase in fuel. So that was the first measure. Obviously, the fishing fleets are still going out, so there's been no disruption like Thailand and the Dutch. And allow me to I had some information ready to throw offhand here. I was following the fishing fleets because I think it's incredibly important to know that our protein sources from the oceans. Again, but that checks the 2030 goals at the end, doesn't it? Like, you're going to only eat farm-raised fish and aquacultured fish. The ocean's got to be left alone from harvesting. So this checks another box of the end of the decade goals there. So
it does.
Yeah, Thailand, half their fishing fleet's not going out. United States, the shrimping fleet is now being affected. So Gulf shrimp, those of you who love shrimp, price is going up. Netherlands, almost all their fishing fleet is in because their fuel cost went from 13,000 to 35,000 just in a matter of a couple of days. So most of the fleet's inside. The UK and Guernsey, the Channel Islands, local fishermen, they're not going out. Bangladesh, Philippines, Australia, fishing fleets, they're already getting hit by diesel shortages anyway. And then India.
Yes.
So think about the imports of whatever nation you're listening to this from. Are you getting fish from any of these countries? Because if you are, there's going to be a fish shortage. Can I even believe this? I'm saying this. Fish is off the plate.
Yeah, well, I bet the fish in the ocean they're going to have a nice recovery because of all the overfishing that's been taking place. So, like, maybe not fishing for a year would actually make the ocean much healthier. But you're right. Humans are not going to have much in the way of the normal ocean fish that they get, or shrimp or lobster or what have you.
Yeah, because I remember in COVID, I think it was, I forget what news station it was, but it was a big headline there for a while with all the videos where huge amounts of deer and huge amounts of wildlife were coming back in the cities because people weren't driving and business as usual stopped and there was hardly anybody on the roads. Everybody's locked in their house. So nature kind of came back into the neighborhoods and thing. Remember that? I'm just wondering how it'll be with the oceans recovering and such things.
Yeah, well, that's a good question because global fuel shortages would impact lots and lots of things, including transportation domestically, air transportation. I think. Well, I'd love to know your guess, but I think in Australia the airlines are going to have to start grounding their planes from lack of fuel. That's probably coming. Do you get any sense or any information there about what this would mean for transportation? And then let me add, Taiwan has a wonderful, monorail system that connects the cities. That's very convenient. But that kind of system doesn't exist in, Australia, right? Or many other countries. So Taiwan could get by better. So could Tokyo, right? In terms of a loss of personal transportation. But that's not true everywhere. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, the grounding of the flights, again, that is a 2030 goal specifically stated you are going to fly once a year, and that is it from this point forward. So end of the decade goal, check. That's 2 already. We've checked in the boxes. You're going to let the oceans recover. You're going to eat farm-raised fish and like lab-grown meat. And remember, that's what the whole plan of this was at the end of the decade, 2030. You're not going to fly either. And then here we are. The Philippines was saying very much the same thing, Mike, that you as a long-haul carrier need to bring your return fuel source with you on the plane or we can't refuel you. Right now in the Philippines, they're like, we can't refuel you. So Australia is going to be at the very same thing. So 2 countries are already saying we can't refuel to fly back. You only can bring enough fuel. So what's the limitation on a Trans-Pacific on that? There's no Trans-Pacific return haul your own fuel back. This would be more inter-Asia. So we're already at that point, at least 2 nations. And Australia is a long way from everywhere. So considering where they're at in Australia and they're starting to whiffs of the same, bring your own fuel for the return. That's going to be very limiting in terms of, we're going back to like Amelia Earhart days where every fuel, stop's going to be very short between something like this. I feel we're rewinding the clock back into the 1930s on, I hope the trade deals do such a thing too, because I can't believe in America, we got all these refineries, we got the biggest energy production in the world, yet our diesel price went up 41% since the beginning of this conflict. We don't even get energy from there. This something has to be redone with the way fuels, produced from the ground in terms of oil or natural gas. The way it's refined and the way it's delivered has to come really regional again. I can't believe we destroyed so much of our infrastructure on this green madness over the last 20 years. I mean, at least here they can turn back on the thermal plants again. Thailand's, they had 2 thermal plants mothballed and they're going to, they're bringing those back up. But it takes about 30 days to get them back online. But in Australia, they actually dynamited them and, took them to the ground and hauled away all the metal as scrap. They don't even have the choice to backstop to even fire them back up again. They're gone. They're gone. Same in Germany. They're gone.
Yeah.
So then what?
Yeah, then what? I mean, I'd like your analysis because everything coming out of the White House right now about the Strait of Hormuz is just flat out lies, just delusion, fantasy. Claims that, we're going to control the strait and Trump is going to call it the Strait of Trump. I don't think that's credible at all. I don't think it's possible for the U.S. to alter the laws of geography and suddenly control the Strait of Hormuz. And if that's the case, then this could be closed for the rest of the year and longer, even multiple years. So what, how does the world function without all that energy that comes out of the Gulf? And, the ammonia, the fertilizer with the urea, with the gas turned into ammonia, etc., the helium, the sulfur, the sulfuric acid, the oil and the natural gas, all that. How does the world function?
Yeah, game that one out, everybody, in your mind for a second. The next thing is going to go down is plastics. Like they're turning down the plants out here to minimum production throughput just to try to stretch what they have for supplies coming into the factories out here. So just in a very basic sense, like plastics are starting to dwindle, but not to zero. That's their first backstop is, all right, we're not going to go at full production. We're going to just keep the minimum throughput to keep this facility open. Whatever it is, it could be blow mold injection, whatever. And there's going to be a slowdown in plastics. But the way our world is so reliant on plastics for packaging, it's just even a wonder how our foods are going to get packaged and delivered on that last mile to the stores. That's a bottleneck in itself to think about. And then the economy, it would not surprise me if the stock markets went down 80 or 90%. I mean, the economic activity is going to be almost nil going through this process here. And, the helium, that's all about the computer electronics and, semiconductor production here, like TSMC. They're going to start slowing down production, although they have months and months of backstop of their own, and they recycle helium and all that. But there's a fair few others, like Intel would take a hit, Micron Technologies, Samsung. they don't have the vast resources as TSMC does to get everything. So you're just going to start to look for all these things in your life that you take for granted start to dry up. Now, working and going to work, everything's going to have to go online. But there's only some things that can go online. Like you can't have a plumber go online. You can't have a factory worker go online. Perhaps some of that could be, done, and maybe they'll retool something where it's more computer oriented through the factories. But the whole AI was taking away jobs anyway. This is just the nail in the coffin to take away the rest of the jobs, keep people at home, and again, introduce UBI, which is, everybody was kind of wondering, like, how are they going to get people to accept UBI and digital rationing cards without putting up a big fuss? Well, here's your answer. It's delivered on a golden platter, and you have to wonder if this whole thing was planned through, again, the 2030 goals, end of the decade, as this is like the one last package to drag everybody across the finish line that didn't go quietly during the COVID era. Because there's too many things that are lining up for all this. And these disruptions you're talking about, these are permanent. You look at some of these plants and storage facilities, pipelines, loading ports, it's destroyed. Like it'll take 5 years plus to bring it back online again. This is a permanent disruption in many ways and forms. Not going to just because the strait opens again, like there's so much destruction of energy and energy delivery systems. And like you say, different things that take natural gas, put it into those precursors to then take it on somewhere else in the production, because there was no NIMBYs in the Middle East. Everything's over there, just as China. The production's there. And no NIMBYs in the desert, right? It's all there, all the production. So, take away 30% of the world's fertilizer, we're going to have the food disruption. Things are going to get expensive on the food side. Even if they've already blown all of this up, like put it in your mind, people out there listening, they have destroyed this infrastructure. It does no longer exist. We're going to have to rebuild it if they ever do. I think the world's going to adjust to this as it is, and I just think there'll be less people around.
Okay, so that's a key question I wanted to ask you. You mentioned in some cases maybe 5 years of a rebuild time, and I've seen estimates that if all the LNG infrastructure is destroyed belonging to Qatar Energy, that rebuild time would be 10 to 15 years. But we're not there yet. It hasn't been completely destroyed yet. It's only been partially destroyed. And they've said they have a 3 to 5 year rebuild time for the 2 trains that have been destroyed. But in your view, you just mentioned there will be fewer people around. If there's a 5 year rebuild time and then we suffer energy and fertilizer and food scarcity for 5 years, what does that look like? I mean, just mass famine, civil unrest. What happens during that time while we're trying to rebuild the system?
Egypt has ordered energy-saving measures, and all stores and restaurants need to close by 9 p.m. All right, so this is going to be the first thing. We're going to do like a COVID 2.0 again here on these lockdowns. There'll be energy lockdown, but it's going to come really fast because we've already been trained. So when they say stores close by 9, because remember, there's no 24-hour stores anymore. Remember back before COVID, like Walmart would be open 24 hours. Some supermarkets like Kroger would be open 24. There was a lot of things that were 24 hours that you could always go in at any time and get. After COVID, nothing was 24 hours after that. Nothing. Everything had specific, maybe 12-hour windows of being open. Now, they're even shrinking those again. Now, if you can't drive to go get it, the next thing would be you're going to be able to drive 1 or 2 days a week, depending on your license plate. And then these store closures, there's been some theoretical analysis on how they're going to work on this. Well, these store hours are going to shrink, and then the days being open are going to shrink, because getting the workers in there on ration days on license plates, they're going to have.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, they're going to try to overlap these. And you're just going to hope that your day to drive overlaps on a day that supermarkets are open. But like, I would say just think pioneering lifestyle. Go back to the bulk goods. Like, those are the things that are going to be available, because the plastics are getting, they're going to get more and more and more restricted until they just have to shut the plants. They won't have enough throughput. And, those take months to come back on again, even if they unsnarl everything. So the plastics for the food itself is something you're not considering. We're going to have to go back to bulk for a lot of things. And then you're going to have to start thinking about 1860s lifestyle and how do you prepare all this from home cooking, because that thing in the bag is not coming. It'll be very, let's say, hard to come by these thin plastics that we use. And you can't just repackage something in a month. You know, that takes years to plan this packaging alone for different products. So maybe they'll stop the shrinkflation where they give you something that has, you know, you look inside and it looks like a big bag and you get in the bottom and it's, you know, only 20% of the bag's full of a product. And maybe they'll actually do it where it actually shrinks down to the size of the product. You get five bags of that if they were realistic instead of trying to hide the shrinkflation in a big bag. You're gonna have to, rethink on how you cook and how you procure your foods. And I think it's gonna gravitate toward bulk for sure. That's the only way it can be, because the world, again, as we knew in 2015-16 after COVID, is like a distant memory. So the post-COVID world, as we go through this set of fuel shortages, will be just a distant memory at the end as well. So things are going to change drastically, and people will fight, and some people will just check out on their own because it's too much to deal with. I would just say understand that the changes are here, and just adapt to the changes as they come. Don't bitch, gripe, and complain. Just, it's here. Things are going to change. Just roll with the changes. And I think you'll be way better off if you're like, all right, this is the way it is now. Okay, great. I'm not going to try to fight and hold on to that old world or the old way it was. I'm just going to quickly snap my fingers and adapt. Okay, well, things are open on Tuesday. Great. Let's readjust everything to get ready for Tuesday. Instead of, well, they shut down, open on that. Cut those things off and just move to the next step. Those are the people I think who are going to do best.
Okay. Well, what if the stores are open on Tuesday, but the shelves are empty?
That would be great. That'd be great to say that you should have been growing some of your own food and had at least a double, triple backup plan with your neighbors, your families, knowing your farmers, raising some of your own proteins. I like bantam chickens myself. We still have the homestead just out here, and then can swing back to that as well. So if you have land and you have to be able to grow food, and you have these plans in place, and people, at least you could alleviate some of that. Getting that meat source is going to be a huge, and also having those oil stockpiled. You know better than I how your brain. Can you run through it for a second? Like, how does your brain function disrupted without proteins and oils? That's a big one too. Like, if you're just stocking veg and you're going to grow veg, you're kind of missing the point of it,
Well, yeah, just calorie restriction actually strongly takes away from cognition, and people's personalities change dramatically after about 2 weeks of no food. What happens is the higher level human cognition functions fade away and they become more animalistic. And what you see across the board is a dropping of societal norms, morals, and values. And instead, the lower brainstem reptilian type of function, kill, steal, survive, eat, that's what happens in societies. And you get into about 45 days of no food, then those traits come out extremely strongly, and then your society is collapsing at that point. I mean, people start dying after 3 weeks of no food.
Yeah, so I'm wondering with an added amount of food, where let's say calorie restriction, you lose half your food source. Now you still have food, but it's restricted in terms of what you used to be used to. So, walk me down that. If you have half the calories you're used to functioning on, but you still do have food, like, would you accept some lab-grown meats at that point? Would you accept lab-grown proteins to fill the belly? I would say almost everybody would say yes.
Yeah, absolutely, and they would accept, cricket protein bars.
Yeah,
they would accept Soylent Green.
Trying to force on it, but everybody rejected it. But if you're hungry enough, you'll eat anything.
Absolutely. If you're hungry enough, you'll eat grasshoppers. And it's interesting. You see, you're in Taiwan right now, and I know because, I used to live there, and I would talk to the old timers. And back in post World War II, it was a common thing in Taiwan for people to catch grasshoppers and pan fry them in a wok with some seasoning, and they would just eat grasshoppers. It was a well-known source of protein. That'll probably happen again.
Well, the snails here too. There's these wild snails that are all over the place, super delicious. If you go to the Richard, which is kind of this, fun restaurant type environment, they always have those snails that are so common around here as well. I mean, there's natural food sources, but the carrying capacity here, there's a lot of people, and would there be enough natural food source to carry? No. Yeah, that's why the imports are coming in.
And that's the thing, is that every city that we can think of around the world, except perhaps not Russia. Russia would be well insulated against this, but most cities, especially Western cities, are highly vulnerable to food scarcity for that very reason that you mentioned, because they import so much food, and you can't grow it locally. I mean, I know people have talked about, well, we can have vertical farms inside these buildings. Okay, great, build it, because they don't exist. If it doesn't exist, it can't grow food. I'm pretty sure it works like that. So just talking about, oh, we can have vertical farms. Yeah, good luck. You can't eat your idea. You actually have to have the food. So the cities are screwed, is the way I see it. That is, if the Strait of Hormuz stays closed for several more months, the cities are screwed. What do you think?
Yeah, if that's the plan, it is going to stay closed, because I'm looking at it more of this thing seems to be gamed out and planned. Is the plan to keep it closed for a certain X amount of months? Well, what's the target on this? Once the target's achieved, and I'm not talking about Trump's goals, I'm talking about this 2030 agenda goal here. Like, how long would they really need to keep it closed to achieve these goals or get people moving to a completely different economy that's now digitized, where people will accept the biometric IDs to be able to eat, and then also to get into the digital system to swap over, because the economy is, 4 months more of Hormuz closure or 6 months more, then like the economy as you understand it on the planet won't be functioning. At that point, it'll have to switch into something else, and they already have the replacement for it. I mean, if you look at the World Bank documents, the International Monetary Fund, and the Bank for International Settlements, the BIS websites, I mean, there's thousands of these, what they have already planned for this digital economy on how they're going to switch over, and how, this digital, all the different, distributed ledger, and through that whole, Ripple on-demand liquidity. I mean, there's rails for payments and, settlements, and everything has been already, and then they got regular money for the people and the stable coins. Like this, there's an entirely different system ready to go at literally a push of a button. But you can't, having two parallel systems of money and movements of money on the planet, it just doesn't work. Like a Highlander, there can be only one. So this would be a great time to allow that to stay closed long enough to disrupt the economy long enough to introduce the new system. Because just as a fact here, I pulled up this one. Peak COVID lockdown led to 8 million barrels per day oil destruction for demand. This one is double, twice as large. So even everything that was done for a COVID-style lockdown and measures, work from home, that it's only going to be 50% effective. They're going to have to regame this, rethink it for another 50% fuel savings off of this. Even if he thought it was harsh wherever you were, because some areas were lighter than others in terms of the lockdowns because of the COVID. But this seems to be unanimously equal around the planet because we all use energy. Like, how do you squeeze another 50% out of the stone here?
But there's a really important difference here, is that during COVID, it was demand destruction, not supply side destruction.
Yes.
And the supply side, we had so much energy that oil prices went negative. Remember that? There was an oil glut back then. There was an energy glut. And today it's exactly the opposite. And whereas back then you said there was about 8 million barrels of oil per day of demand destruction, today there's over 20 million barrels of oil a day of supply side destruction. So, I mean, you're right. It's more than twice as big, but it's far worse because it's supply side, which means that now there's a forced shutdown, not by decree, not by governments saying, close your shop, right? Or don't travel or stay home, lockdowns, but rather there's forced lockdowns because the energy doesn't exist, and forced shutdowns of industry, manufacturers, even in places like Taiwan where you are, they won't have the energy to keep the factory open. So that just sends everybody home in a way that's far worse than the pandemic. The energy doesn't exist, or at least doesn't exist here. It's stuck in the Persian Gulf. So I don't think we've faced anything like this since the 1973-74 oil embargo.
Yeah, or
that was small.
World War II rationing, but the infancy of what we have today in terms of a world. You can't really compare the two. I mean, the interconnectivity and globalism and stuff. But this one here, now another thing that's going to happen for a lot of people first. Now, I don't know if America will do this, but in Cambodia currently, the government's reducing import duties and taxes on petrol and diesel. So they're removing every single tax off the fuel to keep it cheaper. Problem is when they try to put the taxes back on, that's going to be very obvious how much you've been getting scammed off of everything. Secondly, if, like Mike just rightly said, factories close, they send you home, all goods are going to just stop. So Walmarts will start to, be very visible that there won't be things on the shelves because it just won't be manufactured. So the first thing, obviously there's going to be an order and a magnitude of importance of goods being manufactured. Like TSMC on the chips, they're going to be, prioritized. And you could also say pretty much the main industries through all countries. But ones that won't be prioritized are like plastic toys, right? Christmas ornaments, these kind of things that are just making trinkets of junk to send across the ocean. Yet buy two, save global warming, Think about that level of importance to keep military operating. Obviously, the semiconductor chips are like right at the top. Mining would be in there, refining. Because a lot of these shortages, what I'm looking at here is some of the oil flows are still going in, but it seems like the government's taking most of it and stockpiling it, and they're just giving the crumbs to the serfs out here. So I would say, just in what the research I've done, that it seems the governments are taking their lion's share out of it and stockpiling themselves to refill their strategic reserves. And I don't care what country you're in, even in Cambodia, they are pulling fuel off to the side for their own militaries, police forces, and what is left they're giving to. So some of this, I wouldn't say, I hate to use the word artificial, but it is to an extent artificial, where the amount of fuel coming in is not being 100% delivered to the public like it was previously. There is a middleman, for a better term, that is now scurrying some of the fuel off to the side for their own needs in the future. How long will that be before the true shortages start? Yeah, these factories that close, what's going to come off the shelf first? And my big thing is plastics. We can't package a lot of our food. Our food delivery is dependent on that stuff being wrapped in plastic to get it to you. Regardless of the price of diesel goes 5 times, 20 times higher, there will be a truck that will deliver it if the price point is high enough. But for most people, it won't be. It'll be out of their range. So again, we swing back to the UBI. Government's going to have to pay for a lot of people to live. You get into this circle, and it all revolves around 2030, and we're right back in this DNA strand moving again. Every time you talk, it brings you straight back to the end of the decade goals.
Well, yeah, but you just mentioned universal basic income. So if governments end up having to pay UBIs to the population that isn't working, and then also the government has to figure out how to provide food and electricity for the masses that are not working, I mean, it seems obvious that sooner or later the government's going to say, well, we got to get rid of these people. Otherwise, we become insolvent as a government entity because, look at the U.S. debt right now, $39 trillion. If you start adding $1 trillion a month, which is what it would take to put, half the country on a UBI, then you end up in a currency collapse pretty quickly, hyperinflationary collapse. So
walk through the fertilizer wall with me for a second until we get to the feed chain fracture. This is another one a lot of people are not seeing, but the information's out there. So we're getting this fertilizer, which you talked about with the ammonia and nitrogenous fertilizer. We need a lot of natural gas to produce that. Qatar's offline, so we lost about 30% of ammonia and urea production. So 30% global fertilizer gone. It's not coming. So you could think and do your own compost, but that's going to take a little bit of time. You're going to about a year out. But then we get to the feedstock wall, because most of that fertilizer used, at least, and let's walk through American production, goes into either corn or something like this. It's either produced into ethanol, or a lot of it goes to animal feed. Now, if that's not grown and we get, say, a 50% crop yield reduction, then the available animal feed is going to hit that wall too, which then leads to meat and dairy shortages, vanishing livestock herds. And then there's going to be that sort of disruption. Unless you got a contract grow going on, the feed chain is going to fracture off of that. But then again, it brings you back to the plastics. So most of those meats, most of the foods we get are in some sort of plastics. And then that last mile to get it there, the diesel price is going up. Like everywhere you look, fertilizer is going to cost more, meat's going to cost more, packaging is going to cost more, and the diesel to deliver is going to cost more. So you tell me how everything is going to stay the same price for your daily life. I just don't see it. And Americans aren't going to be able to afford it. Damn, they're like living paycheck to paycheck. Like one paycheck will bankrupt a family if they miss one paycheck. And you're looking at 3 or 4 things going up in price here. At least that could just take everybody out. that's on a paycheck to paycheck basis.
Yes, 60% of American families have no savings, paycheck to paycheck. And that means just even a 25% increase in food costs makes them start to experience famine. They just can't buy food. But I guess for a while they can shift to more basics, buying bulk beans and rice and things like that on the shelves instead of ordering Uber Eats, right? Or restaurant food, which people tend to do a lot, even people who can't afford it. But there's a limit even to that, right? At some point, the scarcity is so great and the costs are so high that it seems like the lower income masses end up starving. I don't know any other way to say it. I think we end up in a national crisis here of mass starvation, with the government trying to tell us everything's great, that there are no lines, that no one's hungry because, we have a White House that just lies constantly. I guess they all do. But yeah, no one's hungry.
Yeah,
is that going to be the new press conference from the White House?
Yeah, well, and I'm wondering the health implications too of this, because during COVID, people switched over to fast food because it was cheaper than all the other foods, and if you were locked down, you could get it delivered. Now, what about people trying to save money? Now the fast food's gotten quite expensive comparatively during the COVID days. So if you're going to try to exist on something that's really, really, really cheap in the store, it's going to be 1,000% just chemical. The toll on the human body, Mike, like you're better equipped to answer that question. But how long can you really eat those substandard foods before your body either shuts down or your mind behaves differently? You get into those personality changes. I mean, can you walk me through that for a moment?
I think the gist of your question is if people shift to cheaper food sources, what is the cumulative effect of the nutritional deficiencies and also, processed calories? And it's severe, but I think we're already experiencing that. We have rampant obesity, we have a rampant decline of cognition. These are already the results of Americans living on processed foods. I think that the real question is going to be when they can't even afford the processed foods. And I guess at that point, obesity gives people a little bit of a buffer time. Like, hey, my neighbor could eat or could not eat for 3 months and still be okay. And that's actually true. Obesity is stored calories. So that gives obese people a little bit of an extended time to not die. But it doesn't mean they're going to be in good health, obviously. And, suddenly fasting for 60 days for someone who's never fasted, I bet you like Trump's religious advisor will say, we all have to fast now for Jesus or something, and then that'll be, you're not supposed to eat for 30 days. So some nonsense like that.
Cutting down to 2 meals a day. Yeah, fasting too. Like if you're going to get into a fast, it's more of a mental game where you get yourself prepped and you're super excited about it. All right, I'm going to go through, I'm going to cleanse. Like you're getting your mind ready for it as well. If you just were your normal days going along and then suddenly, boom, you don't get food for 3 days, that's a very different type of mind frame than if you're preparing yourself with the proper hydration and getting ready. And then, you get those 3 days and you're really working through it to try to cleanse yourself. Those are two different worlds to exist in. It can be done, but again, that trauma of going through that just instantly hit with no food, not out of expectation versus expecting it and enjoying the experience and getting ready for it as, a rite of passage, if you will. That I just don't know how they're going to sell it to people. Eat 2 meals a day and fast 1 day a week or 2 days a week. You'll get through the food thing. It's all good. There'll be a lot of breakdowns here, I think, coming up. I don't know the timeline on it for America. Each individual nation is going to have a different timeline hitting this same exact wall.
Right. Well, and clearly we'll have grocery store rationing the same way they did in Venezuela years ago, where you have to sign in with your biometrics in order to buy food, and then you're only allowed a certain amount of food, and you might have to wait in an 8-hour line to be allowed into the grocery store to get your minimum, or your quota of food. so much rice, one chicken a month, whatever. But that's going to be tied to your account, which is controlled by the government. So effectively, it's kind of an enforced CBDC with food rationing, especially if that's free government money, like a UBI hybrid CBDC. It's like, here's your free money, but there's a purchase quota. You can only buy so much stuff, and we're going to track you. We're going to enforce it centrally. So that's how they walk millions of people into a controlled wallet system, is through famine.
Yeah, that's the greatest driver, isn't it? Because I know in Thailand, they're putting license plate readers out at the petrol stations now. So when you go through, you can get your supply, but you cannot return the same days. And your license, it gets flagged into the system. They're putting out that if you're trying to cheat the system and go multiple times and bring your motorbike or your car through and then go home and siphon it off and then come back and continuously do this loop, that you will be arrested for doing that. So they're already onto it and using technologies to try to prevent other people from hoarding gas. Even though it appears you're just going to get your quota of filling, that's it, and then you return the next day. You're already on record as doing that. So the technology is at that level where they're, and we're talking about Thailand petrol stations. They're already using advanced technology to make sure you don't go and continuously buy fuel and hoard it. So we're already at that level anyway. Now, the only thing I might say that could be a godsend on this is if there is a helium disruption to the largest extent, then a lot of these, semiconductor chips and things that make all of this apparatus move might be disrupted or pushed back a few years and give us a longer window before the implementation of everything, as well as some of the data center slowdown because of the materials inputs won't be there based on this disruption. That's the only positive looking at this coming out that could be, I guess, if you're looking at it in a wider view here.
I think maybe the other silver lining is that there will no longer be denial of the agenda. Hopefully they will realize that that was the plan the whole time, was to engineer a way to shut off the world's energy system. In other words, see, I don't know about you, David, but I think that this war, it doesn't make any rational sense because the Strait of Hormuz was open before Trump ordered the attack on Iran. But the only way it makes rational sense is if they want global famine. You see what I mean?
Not just close it, but to destroy everything that makes our world work out of that area is, that's the final linchpin there, I think.
If the war is the cover story for this, then there's no incentive for Trump to end the war. He would want it to continue, but it just keeps telling the public that we're going to seize the strait and reopen the strait just to kind of string people along, while the actual plan is to, starve half of you or maybe more.
Yeah, and if I could add one point now, those of you who are surfing the news a little bit, now understand the disruptions currently are at like around 17 to 20 million barrels, depending on what metric you're using. The Yamal East-West pipeline in Saudi Arabia is currently at max, and they've verified 7 million barrels a day in Saudi Arabia, now loading in the Red Sea from the Yamal pipeline. If that were to be hit, that would be the absolute end of the economies of the planet, because that 7 million barrels would go offline like instantly. The pipeline would have to be shut down, obviously, if it was destroyed in sections. And, if you hear anything in the news about the Yamal pipeline being destroyed, then that truly would be such a devastating moment for humanity that if it goes to that point and they take that out, then that's the plan truly to starve the planet, because there will be not enough energy for even basic operation from almost everything. That pipeline, that 7 million barrels a day, is truly the lifeline coming out. If that were to be destroyed, then we're going to have to rethink a lot of things.
And we might have only 4 billion people left living on the planet by that time. Is what I'm saying.
Yeah, I think the carrying capacity is a little bit lower than that. I think it's probably around 2.8 billion. If you take it back and you look how the Industrial Revolution allowed us to ramp up to certain benchmarks that we hit in population, Coal brought us someplace, steam brought us others. The oil finally was the trigger that brought it up from 1 billion and above. It was oil. Coal and all that other thing that was, pre-industrial revolution or included in that time frame when we switched over to using fossil fuels and being able to crack that and get in, different distillates and the gas and the diesel and that sort of thing. That didn't occur until the early 1900s, really at a mass. And then it really didn't get adopted and used widely until, say, the 1920s. So then you start to take that benchmark of population, and where did it go from 1920s to World War II? And then kind of I'm right there at that. All right, that's truly where we would be sitting if we lose this much oil. Roll it back to the World War II days of production. And then, you put there, and all right, it's around 2.8, 2.9 max. And that was it. And then we grew from there. And those other 8 billion people, those 5 billion people arrived in the last, 100 years or less. So if you're going to walk the clock back 90 years to, World War II, then that's kind of where we would sit in population based on oil production from that era. And the numbers would match up with what that would be if we start losing more out of the Middle East. I know America could ramp it up, but they're not. So there's a disconnect here of these countries that are supposedly having these vast oil reserves, and they have the refineries, but they're still having shortages. So there's huge disconnect on what's going on. It's got to be a purposeful turn down, or it just half these things don't make sense anyway on how there can be massive shortages in all these producers with the refineries. It's just, I'm missing something.
If you think about what's actually happening right now in the war, it's that Israel keeps bombing infrastructure in Iran, and then Iran responds by bombing, permanently destroying energy infrastructure in the Gulf states, while the U.S. says we're not bombing, but Israel does. And so Iran keeps retaliating. Regardless of who might be assigned the blame for this, the net effect is that the energy infrastructure, the gas infrastructure, fertilizer infrastructure that feeds our planet is being destroyed, essentially permanently or for years to come. This dynamic, I don't see any off-ramp to this dynamic. Do you?
I don't, because it's just going to keep going this back and forth. And taking out a desalinization plant just yesterday, that in itself would cause migration out of the area. People that are working in these plants and in these oil industry in the Middle East, they're there because they have desalinization and they have food deliveries. If you're even able to disrupt the water source enough to make it move. Now look through history, how many remnants of great cities do we see in the deserts around the world? They left because there was no water. And if you wanted a population to leave, so the actual workforce would leave to even operate those facilities, you would just take away the water. And there would be nobody there to operate the facilities, even if they were not destroyed. The only way they ever come back online again is if they bring a water source back in there. True. So if you're going to game it out, you would remove the food and the water to allow all those millions of people to live in the desert in an area and an inhospitable location that they could not live without that technology of desalinization. So if the desal plants continue to get destroyed, the population will have to migrate out. There will be no way for them to even live without water. So then that adds another whole complexity. Yeah, the plant maybe was partially destroyed. There will be nobody there to repair it because they can't live there because there's no water. You can only bring in so much water. Water's heavy. They're trying to fly in emergency air deliveries into, the UAE. They're trying to bring in 180,000 pounds of food per flight. And I'm just thinking, you guys are insane. You know how vast the population, 180,000 pounds at a time, and you're taking breaks because the runway's being bombed, and Iran's going, okay, you can bring in 2 planes today. I'm like, wait a minute, that's not even 500,000 pounds of food for Dubai. Yeah. And I think, well, that math doesn't work on that, nor does the water.
No, it doesn't. Airdrops aren't going to work in the long run, for food deliveries. Just like driving oil on the road also doesn't feed the world. It's not possible. You have to transport oil by ocean, right? The economics don't work. What I'm trying to get at here is that we've built, as a species, an infrastructure that has allowed us to expand to 8 billion people with all these needs for desalination of water, and artificial constructs called cities that import food and that import power, etc. And this is all dependent on infrastructure that is now being just day by day obliterated. This just seems like a suicide cult to me. And I'm just curious. I mean, we're almost done with the interview here, but just curious, like, what's your big takeaway from all of this? What does this make you think about?
I think there's a larger cycle in play. You know, when you look at some of these rainfall patterns across the deserts in North Africa and the Middle East, there's substantially more rainfall. So if you're looking back in terms of large cycles, I would put this one on a once in a 4,000 year cycle. And I was talking with Michael Yolen yesterday. We were talking about different maps. And, you know, even if you go back to the 1600s and you look at some of these maps, it shows desert where they are now are forests on the 1500s maps. It shows green in the Gulf of Oman. It shows green across swaths of Saudi Arabia. It shows deserts in, places like southern Egypt and southern Libya. There were still deserts that are on the maps with waterways flowing. So if you can get such a turnaround of just a few hundred years, perhaps they know there's a much larger cycle coming in that will disrupt the very world that we have anyway in terms of food production and locations that things and food and these sources of life can be produced on the planet, to where an assessment is like, it's unsalvageable anyway. Let's just try to extract wealth, move it to areas on the planet that probably will survive, and then we'll reset up. And I am absolutely of the volition that the North Africa is going to be a new growing area. They can tap all those sandstone aquifers beneath, from the Sus aquifer to the Nubian sandstone aquifer, and then all the above ground, rainfall patterns are shifting. So you're getting double rotation crops on, lightly used soils, the entire shift of a planet. But to try to explain that to people and say, hey, you know what, we knew this thing was coming for about 50 years. We didn't warn anybody, but we all want you to move to different locations because it's just not going to work the way the world's structured right now. That's the 30,000-foot view. I'm looking at this thing, that there's a much larger cycle inbound here, and it's truly going to affect the world to that point of disruption of food production anyway, that now there's a culpable excuse like, oh, well, the fertilizer failed. No, it wasn't because of jet stream shift on a magnetic field depletion event that was causing that. No, we didn't teach you to grow your own food. No, it was because of the Middle East fertilizer disruption. Like something at this grand scale of monumental shifts on the map here that are occurring. And that's kind of the way I'm assessing this whole thing. It's a much larger cycle in play that's driving most of this on a timeline.
So we know that you're tracking this. You're going to be reporting. Tell our audience about your sites and your podcasts and your channels, et cetera.
Yeah, the Adapt 2030 channel, this is going to be my main thing from now, in addition to reporting on some of the weather events, obviously. But I am going to be doing the fuel and the fertilizer reports out here for most of Asia, because I scrape through the news every day, try to figure out what's going on, where the shortage is hitting, where they're not, what's still not disrupted, and then give a little timeline on it moving forward as, okay, well, it's anticipated that this might happen and this delivery dates, because if it's going to be hitting here first, and then it will move around the planet as just it did with COVID, So it's going to be in certain locations that are going to be more greatly affected first. See how that plays out, how, it changes society, how the behavior patterns, food choices, this sort of thing. I want to live in it while it's happening. And then, how is that going to sweep around the rest of the world? Because that should give you an indication on how you can brace for impact, basically. So that's it. Adapt 2030 channel and the Civilization Cycle podcast. Just show people out there what's really happening beyond the news that you're being fed with this AI curation. Like what's really happening on the ground with a guy with two eyeballs looking at it, compared to the pretty images that AI is generating to try to get you to believe that there's more of this, that, or the other happening.